his orders. Even the children were ready to march together, a pretty flock, and at the last moment Mrs. Blackett and a few distinguished companions, the ministers and those who were very old, came out of the house together and took their places. We ranked by fours, and even then we made a long procession. There was a wide path mowed for us across the field, and as we moved along, the birds flew up out of the thick second crop of clover, and the bees hummed as if it were still June. There was a flashing of white gulls over the water where the fleet of boats rode the low waves together in the cove, swaying their small masts as if they kept time to our steps. The splash of the water could be heard faintly, yet still be heard. We might have been a company of ancient Greeks going to celebrate a victory, or to worship the god of harvest in the grove above. It was strangely moving to see this and to make part of it. The sky, the sea, have watched poor humanity at its rites so long. We were no more a New England family celebrating its own existence and simple progress. We carried the tokens and inheritance of all such households from which this had descended, and were only the latest of our line. We possessed the instincts of a far-forgotten childhood. I found myself thinking that we ought to be carrying green branches and singing as we went. So we came to the thick, shaded grove still silent, and were set in our places by the straight trees that swayed together, and let sun shine through here and there like a single golden leaf that flickered down, vanishing in the cool shade. The grove was so large that the great family looked far smaller than it had in the open field. There was a thick growth of dark pines and firs, with an occasional maple or oak that gave a gleam of color like a bright window in the great roof. On 3 sides we could see the water, shining behind the tree trunks, and feel the cool, salt breeze that began to come up from the tide just as the day reached its highest point of heat. We could see the green sunlit field we had just crossed, as if we looked out at it from a dark room, and the old house and its lilacs standing placidly in the sun, and the great barn with a stockade of carriages from which 2 or 3 caretaking men who had lingered were coming across the field together. Mrs. Todd had taken off her warm gloves and looked the picture of content. "There!" she exclaimed. "I've always meant to have you see this place, but I never looked for such a beautiful opportunity, weather and occasion both made to match. Yes, it suits me. I don't ask no more. I want to know if you saw Mother walkin' at the head. It choked me right up to see Mother at the head walkin' with the ministers," said Mrs. Todd, turned away to hide the feelings she could not instantly control. "Who was the marshal?" I hastened to ask. "Was he an old soldier?" "Don't he do well?" answered Mrs. Todd with satisfaction. "He don't often have such a chance to show off his gifts," said Mrs. Kaplan, a friend from the landing who had joined us. "That's Sant Bowden. He always takes the lead such days. Good for nothing else most of his time. Trouble is, he—" I turned with interest to hear the worst. Mrs. Kaplan's tone was both zealous and impressive. "Stimulates," she explained scornfully. "No, Santon never was in the war," said Mrs. Todd with lofty indifference. "It was a cause of real distress to him. He kep' enlistin', and traveled far and wide about here, and even took the boat and went to Boston to volunteer. But he ain't a sound man, and they wouldn't have him. They say he knows all their tactics, and can tell all about the Battle of Waterloo, well's he can Bunker Hill. I told him once the country'd lost a great general, and I meant it, too." "I expect you're near right," said Mrs. Kaplan, a little crestfallen and apologetic. "I be right," insisted Mrs. Todd, with much amiability. "'Twas most too bad to cramp him down to his peaceful trade, but he's a most excellent shoemaker at his best, and he always says it's a trade that gives him time to think and plan his maneuvers. Over to the port they always invite him to march Decoration Day, same as the rest, and he does look noble. He comes of soldier stock." I had been noticing with great interest the curiously French type of face which prevailed in this rustic company. I had said to myself before that Mrs. Blackett was plainly of French descent, in both her appearance and her charming gifts, but this is not surprising when one has learned how large a proportion of early settlers on this northern coast of New England were of Huguenot blood, and that it is the Norman Englishman, not the Saxon, who goes adventuring to a new world. "They used to say in old times," said Mrs. Todd modestly, "that our family came of very high folks in France, and one of 'em was a great general in some of the old wars. I sometimes think that Santin's ability has come way down from then. 'Tain't nothin' he's ever acquired. 'Twas born in him. I don't know's he ever saw a fine parade, or met with those that studied up such things. He's figured it all out and got his papers, so he knows how to aim a cannon right for William's Fish House 5 miles out on Green Island, or up there on Burnt Island where the signal is. He had it all over to me one day, and I tried hard to appear interested. His life's all in it, but he will have those poor gloomy spells come over him now and then he has to drink." Mrs. Kaplan gave a heavy sigh. "There's a great many such stray-away folks, just as there is plants," continued Mrs. Todd, who was nothing if not botanical. "I know of just one sprig of laurel that grows over back here in a wild spot, and I never could hear of no other on this coast. I had a large bunch brought me once from Massachusetts way, so I know it. This piece grows in an open spot where you'd think it would do well, but it's sort of poor-lookin'. I visited it time and again just to notice its poor blooms. 'Tis a real St. Bowden, out of its own place." Mrs. Kaplan looked bewildered and blank. "Well, all I know is, last year he worked out some kind of a plan so's to parade the county conference in platoons, and got 'em all flustered up trying to sense his ideas of a holler square," she burst forth. "They was holler enough anyway after ridin' way down from up country into the salt air, and they'd been treated to a sermon on faith and works from old Feyther Harlow that never knows when to cease. 'Twa'n't no time for tactics then. They wa'n't a-thinkin' of the church military. Sant, he couldn't do nothin' with 'em. All he thinks of when he sees a crowd is how to march 'em. 'Tis all very well when he don't tempt too much. He never did act like other folks." "Ain't I just been maintaining that he ain't like 'em?" urged Mrs. Todd decidedly. "Strange folks has got to have strange ways, for what I see." "Somebody observed once that you could pick out the likeness of most every sort of a foreigner when you looked about you in our parish," said Sister Kaplan, her face brightening with sudden illumination. "I didn't see the bearin' of it then quite so plain. I always did think Mary Harris resembled a Chinee." "Mary Harris was pretty as a child, I remember," said the pleasant voice of Mrs. Blackett, who, after receiving the affectionate greetings of nearly the whole company, came to join us, to see, as she insisted, that we were out of mischief. "Yes, Mary was one of them pretty little lambs that make dreadful homely old sheep," replied Mrs. Todd with energy. "Captain Littlepage never'd look so disconsolate if she was any sort of a proper person to direct things. She might divert him, yes. She might divert the old gentleman and let him think he had his own way, 'stead of arguing everything down to the bare bone. 'Twouldn't hurt her to sit down and hear his great stories once in a while." "The stories are very interesting," I ventured to say. "Yes, you always catch yourself a-thinkin'